we're very grateful and feel blessed to have Jaya and Sadhana Devi with us. They're among the earliest Ananda participants. They're pioneers for sure. Way back at the very beginning in the late 60s, they knew Swami Kriyananda. They met him, and they came very, very early on and intimately involved with the development of the village community from the very beginning. And ever since then has dedicated their lives to sharing the teachings of Master, participating in village life for that first decade or so, and then when the outreach began, uh, continuing to do whatever Swamiji asked of them. And so they ended up in India, where uh, Jaya now is one of the spiritual directors of the entire work all over India. And while at the village, Jaya served as a general manager of the village, overseeing the planning and development, housing, business clusters, all of that. The same role that, or at least similar, that Atman, who was with us a few weeks ago, has now in the village. And they've had experience not only at Ananda Village, but also helping to found the center in New England and guiding Ananda's work on the East Coast of the US. And then about 15 years ago, Swami asked them to come to India, and they went there. So they've had a variety. They've lived at the village for many years and raised a child there, so have experience with the schools and what it's like to be a family and community and all the pros. And there are always a few cons to life, whatever it is, of doing these things the way that we do them. So anyway, we're thrilled to have them with us. So I'll turn it over to them, and they'll can begin with a prayer and a chant or a little meditation as you see fit. Thank
Okay.
you again for being here.
Well, yes, like I mean, thank you very much, Ramurti Sita. The We're really happy to be here and to be able to share with you this evening. We're doing this from Ananda Village, and we're having a really nice rainstorm outside right now, one of the first big ones of the year. So it's very auspicious, I like to think. We're going to start. I would like to start with a prayer. So I have asked Sadhana Devi to do one chant. We'll meditate just for a minute or so, just to collect ourselves, and then we'll launch forth. And at that time, I'll explain a little bit more about what we're going to talk about this evening. I think all of you saw the maybe or not, the flyer that went out, and the number of questions and suggested topics listed there, and we'll try to address as many of those things as we can. So let's start with a prayer, inviting the presence of the gurus, the masters, to join us and guide us and be with us this evening. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters of self-realization, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Paramhansa Yogananda. I invoke the presence of Swami Kriyananda, the great founder of our work of spiritual communities, Ananda Village, and many of the other works that have come out of that. Invoke all of your presence that we may work in thy joy, being instruments for the divine to flow through us to reach out to many souls in this world, bringing them to their own highest potential, helping guide the work of Babaji and the Masters to express these teachings of Kriya Yoga in practical ways through demonstration of how to live in God in daily life. Om Shanti. Amen. What we'd like to share with you today is some of the lessons as you've read that the flyer that was put out, introduction to this class. So such things as stories of the challenges faced, stories of the creating the community. Well, there's one about Pune. Are there key considerations and so on? Those types of things. That's a lot, and we're going to just make a start on it. And then there's also the other part here, which maybe Sadhana Devi is going to go a little bit addresses family life in the community with also a number of bullet points as well. And is that I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes and then I'm going to open it up to questions. But if we could keep the questions on the points that I make, because I'm going to come back later and we're going to do more. So, but rather than if a question is arose with something I said, then I don't want it to get lost and forgotten. And I will stop and try to answer briefly some of those questions. And if there is none, well, then we'll proceed. Sadhana is then going to do the same thing and then also invite questions, and we'll go back and forth a couple of times like that, so that rather than leaving all the questions to the end, because yeah. Anyway, but our goal here is, of course, when you do ask the questions, is don't go too far out in left field with it, because otherwise. Anyway, with that said, let me start with. Thanking again everybody to being here. And as Ramurti said, Sadhana Devi and I came to Swami Kriyananda, participating in Ananda before there was a community of Ananda Village. Now, that does not say that there was not a community. There was not a piece of land that was identified with that community. And of course, in the early days, Swamiji, there was some thought that we would be able to start a community there at the meditation retreat, that first property that we owned in Nevada County. But really, the community, even in that sense, not in a physical sense, but just like what you're having right now, that community existed in San Francisco in the Bay Area, where Swami was. It was a group of people coming together regularly for satsang, meditating together, instruction at different locations in San Francisco and the Bay Area, where Swamiji was living at that time and where he was teaching. And he would conduct weekly satsangs on Sundays, and he would also do them on Thursday evenings. Now, it was those Thursday evening satsangs that I began to attend in 1968 and over that winter into early 69. So you could say the community was started then, but he had written a book at that time, and that book was Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why. And I read that book at the 50th anniversary a year and a half ago. First time I'd reread it, and gosh, I hate to say it, but it was probably 35 years. I hadn't read it since then. And it was a wonderful book. I thought he had foresight. But if you read that book, it was a book of principles, just general philosophical principles of people working together, very important ones. And if you notice, we followed a lot of those principles in the creation of Ananda. But it was not a how-to manual. In other words, the practical day-to-day manual. And Swami recognized that. He often joked, I wrote this book about how to start a community, and I had no experience myself other than what he had read, and he would joke about that. But nevertheless, that day-to-day part is something that manifested itself when we ended up buying the property that has become known as Ananda Village, because people began, this was 1969, people came, and we purchased that property in 1969 July. And between July, August, and September, and let's say into October, maybe 3 to 4 months worth, we had a deluge of people showing up there. Some, a good portion, maybe half at least, who knew Swami and were, you might say, people who had been introduced to that community of souls at some point or before arriving there, and they saw this potential and they came and wanted to experience. But a good half of those people, and maybe even more, had never met Swamiji in their life. They had no idea of what Swamiji was about and what he wanted to create. And now, of course, people would read that book, but like I said, it had principles. It didn't necessarily have a manual. And so we found that we went through 4 months. Imagine this, a piece of property, 50 people show up on that, says, and Swami, you might say, not literally, but figuratively, says, well, go to it, start a community. What in the world are you going to do? And most people did not know each other. So, but they were good intentioned. yeah, good intentions, and that is, I think, looking back, was one of the saving graces that people had idealistic intentions. They were idealistic. And so, but translating idealism into practical working together, 50 people, it was mess, and it was difficult, and people didn't. There was no direction because Swami was not involved in that at all, particularly. Jyotish was there, and Jyotish, but he certainly didn't have the status, and as Swami's the disciple as he does maybe now. But it was very chaotic. People coming together, and the reason Swami was involved because he was 100% involved pretty much up at the meditation retreat where he was doing programs. He was busy as could be, going out, teaching, writing, lecturing, and this was a project that was happening, and it was chaotic. Now, oftentimes you'll hear stories ruefully looking back on those times. Oh, it was a terrible time. But it was actually a good time if you appreciate energy. And fortunately, Swami is often expressed over the years, and people quote, he expressed a lot of frustrations about the difficulties he ran into. People were not in tune, and so on. But he, I think that was only part of himself when in those moments of frustration. On the other hand, Swami was a great appreciator of energy, and people had energy, but no direction of how to do that. Now, looking back, I think what a lesson is there. It would have been good if we would have had a common intention. Remember what the cooperative community, intention, it's an intentional community. Now, what is an intentional community? It means you're trying to accomplish something that you've thought of ahead of time. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? And what is your intent? So anybody who's starting a community, you have to go back to basic principles, I believe, and ask yourself, what is the intent? What do you want to do? What are you trying to do? Because there's a lot of kind of communities, and many people came and they had different ideas of what the intention was. And where are we going? Was it going to be a commune? Was it going to be a suburban, housing development? Like, there's all over the place, and most people had no idea. And you could say this is why one of our favorite phrases from those, we're making it up as we go along. And fortunately, young people are pretty adaptable, and we were all young, and we had good intention to do something good. And the one thing that did bind us all is that we had a spiritual aspiration, all of us, but not necessarily the same spiritual aspiration. And so one of the things, the lessons when we look back is, one is clarifying intention of what are we trying to do, goals, what's our goals, and cohesion, cohesive goals. You see, it's fine to say we want a spiritual community, but when you put that ideal into practice, we had no cohesion. And it wasn't until the end of that first year, 1969, and it gets cold up here in about now. It starts to get cold, and there was no housing. There was no place for people to stay. And it became obvious that most people, of those 50 people that were there, they're going to have to go do something. So people began to drift off. And it reduced itself to a very small number. Many went to San Francisco with the idea of making money and then coming back. But at the same time, in the background, we needed to become cohesive. And Swami spelled it out right at the end there of that year, in October of that year, because he saw it was crazy, chaotic, and people were doing all sorts of things going. And there was no unity of spiritual purpose. And he made it very clear. He says that the purpose of this community is to serve the goals and ideals of Paramhansa Yogananda. That's what we're here. He says, if it's not going to be that, I will not stay. And but that's what I would like it to be. And so go, disperse, make some money, get some skills, do whatever needs to, and then come back in the spring and that's where we're going. And people did that. Sadhana Devi, she went off and did something similar to that. And they came back, and we had cohesion when we came, everybody came back. But one of the cohesive things was we were devotees. We were working together to create a vision of Paramhansa Yogananda. But what is that? We did not know, but the community reduced to a very small number. And I say the community really began in 1970 when we were cohesive in that spiritual vision. And a certain event happened that I think was significant. Came back. We probably grew back in the spring, or maybe we were up to 20 people again. Now then it continued to grow and kept on going. But we had about 20 people, and we instituted a plan that we had talked about the previous year but never did. We set a membership fee. $1,000 for a single person, $1,500 for a couple. Any new person, now we grandfathered everybody, us 20 that were there, we grandfathered, or however, we were grandfathered in.
We got out cheap.
But anybody that came from there had to pay his fee if they wanted to join that community. There was no entrance of any sort in that 69. People came and it was just amazingly chaotic. But the next year, we said, no, that didn't work. Have to pay this fee. But that wasn't that slowed, you might say, the people showing up. And they would come, and if they had good, we formed a membership committee to deal with new people who were coming in. And then the more significant thing is we instituted a monthly fee for everybody. And this month, and there was, I remember it as $65. Now that's not a lot of money. But in those days, it was actually, it was, 1970, maybe it was a little more than it, but it was 65. Everybody had to pay $65 a month to keep and it was apportioned out for different things. Pay the mortgage, half of it went to that, the other half went to fixing up stuff. Everybody had to do that, and this was a requirement. And I think this was a very important step because it separated those who really wanted to be there and be serious from those who weren't. And the other thing was, it made people take responsibility. And this was important too. You just show up and not pay anything and just do at your own whim. It's not healthy. And so we instituted that, and people began to take responsibility, and we began to become cohesive in the sense that we were partners. You could say all of us together were a community in financial responsibility, and we took that burden off of the shoulders of Swami Kriyananda. So those two parts of responsibility and cohesion of vision of what we're trying to do, and then out of that, when we had this monthly responsibility, everybody, we realized we needed to have somebody running things, making decisions, and in a more formal way. And so we began, this is basically in Swami's, direction here. We've had Jyotish became managers, Seva became the finance person, and this people volunteered for different roles. Somebody wanted to do the garden, and we ended up, Honel became, some of you may remember, came. And we started, and we've had this principle to keep in mind. Authority goes with responsibility. If you're going to take responsibility for some area of the community, you gain the authority to make some decisions about that. You don't have authority if you don't take responsibility. You see, you have to have, the two go together. You can't be in charge of something unless you take responsibility. If it goes wrong, or you bear the burden of making sure it works. So those principles and that very little basic structure, that the community then began. And of course, then we had to decide how our decisions going to be made. We were small enough at those days to have consensus meetings. You're talking 20 people, that's not so hard. But by the time you get up to 50 people again, you start having committees.
Ugh.
But that's just the natural growth. But those principles, and I'm gonna ask for questions now, and then I'm going to give it to Sadhana Devi, and then she's going to speak. I'll come back and then speak some more. Does anybody have a question that is by this time that has come up? No, no question. Okay,
I,
good.
I would,
Or is there? Yes, I don't know.
yeah, I was gonna say when you now the $1,500 fee, was that like a one-time fee or was that like an annual fee or
Oh, one-time fee. One-time fee.
One time.
okay, and the 65 was monthly,
65 was monthly. Now,
but that was in 70.
Mm-hmm.
1970.
Okay.
I don't know what that means today, but it's not probably not that much today. But it was the idea was something. You just couldn't come and hang out. In other words, and
And so
when they
how were
yes,
I was gonna say that that $65 basically was what? What did that pay for or whatever?
well, basically what it was is we actually broke it into two. We said it's 30 and 35. And I don't remember which was which, but one of those went to pay the mortgage. It was dedicated to paying the mortgage. And you'll hear Swami tell story. Well, you won't hear him now, but but you tell stories about how he had to go out and he got tired of having to bear that burden on his own shoulders, and that, yeah, very rightly so. So, but once we came back and started in the spring, we said no. It's if we're going to make this work, we can't rely on Swami Kriyananda to pay the rent here. We have to pay the mortgage, and then the other 30 or 35, whichever one it was, that went to basic maintenance. Somebody's got to pay we have to pay the electric bill. We have to fix some of the worst of the potholes maybe, or nobody got a salary in those days. It was there, so there was no salaries. It was all volunteer. Everybody who did anything was volunteer. But
And then
there was to do.
what kind of living conditions were at that time?
It was basic.
Basic.
Okay.
There was people basically. It was an old ranch. It was an old ranch,
Very.
and people put up tents, teepees. There's all those stories about teepees, but tents and teepees. People, tree houses. People converted little
Trailers.
parts of the barn. They had a barn, chicken coops. The old farmhouse had a couple of bedrooms upstairs that people would they kind of went into. Some people, a couple of mobile trailers
Right.
showed up, and so it's whatever people could do, they nooks and crannies. So it was very basic, and
Was there electricity or was it
but
like
there was electricity in the area where, if you know Ananda Village now, it's in the area where the market is, the farm, that's the old farmhouse, and the barn. There was electricity in the farmhouse and the barn and the utility buildings. And just in that area, there was, when we started, there was no running water, but there was a spring, and there had been running water. We just had to rehabilitate it. And from a spring box up the hill a little ways, we piped in water. No sanitary facilities. We had to dig outhouses for that. You could say that was 1969's job, was to get the infrastructure working again. And by 70 we had basics, but everybody was responsible for making that $65 a month, you see, and their food, and so everybody had to take personal responsibility, which meant people needed to have, unless they had private savings, they needed to find a job. And there had to become an economy, had to be created. Now some people had the facility and they took that on as their duty, is to try to create some sort of an economy, and many different little things started happening, but that's a whole nother story, which I can cover later if
and
it's
then how about food? What was everyone doing for food?
in the first year. In 69 we had a communal kitchen,
Right.
but the only income that was coming in from the meditation retreat programs that Swami was doing on the weekends up there, and what people would come during the week. So that income was subsidizing the food as at the communal kitchen down on the where the village is now. We realized once the retreat season ended, there was no income, and so that was one reason to bring the year to an end. And the next year we said we can't continue to do that. So people were responsible for their own food. But we did have a kitchen facilities there in that main area, and people wherever they, made do wherever they camped out. It was basic. I remember a communal lunch trying to go, and people would pay some money, and we would, groups of people would get together, and the big job in those first years was just physically getting the place functioning, and that took a little time. So, Sadhana Ji, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Okay.
I'm going to move this closer to her because her
Yes.
voice is softer than
And
mine.
I also think it would be better to move this just a bit there.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, I see. It cuts you off. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, that's all right. That's all right. I think
Okay.
I'm kind of here.
Right. Okay. Well, I came to Ananda after after college. I found a job in my field, and I didn't like it. That didn't take very long, and I then began looking for people that people that I had like mind with, that might be interested in the things that interested me. And lo and behold, TM happened, and so I got a chance to actually learn to meditate. That was very nice. It was not so hard as I thought it would be, and I'd gone with a few friends to take this little course together. So we all finished it up, and we went home, and my friends all quit. But I stuck with it. I liked the fact that it was happening, although I wasn't quite sure that I liked the way that it was done, but I did like that. And then I realized that, yeah, this is something I want to do. This is something I would like to do. And so then I noticed, though, there was something really important that was missing, and that was friends of like mind. I had a really difficult, felt there was a big hole there. And just to meditate on my own by myself did not appeal to me. I wanted to meet people that were, had similar ideas as I did, and that we could do things such as meditating together. Well, later on, not much later though, I actually ran into an old friend. Some of you know this person. His name is Benai. He's at Ananda Village in Nevada County, and he's been there for decades with his family. And but at the time, it only was a couple of years that I had known him. And so I ran into him, and I asked him what he was doing. He said, well, I'm caretaking some property up in the Sierras, and it's owned by a man who is going to start a meditation retreat in the spring. And that, of course, I was so excited to hear that. I could barely speak. And I said, do you think I could come and stay up there or at least visit? And he said, yeah, but not now. It's covered with snow. You wouldn't want to come up here now. It was January. And so I got together, we had some other mutual friends, and they were thinking they'd like to come up at least for that retreat in the spring. And so I got together with him, and we decided to carpool, and we made arrangements. It all worked out just fine. We went up there in the spring and got to the meditation retreat, and it was just so nice. It was in the forest. There were trees everywhere. And there were, at the same time, there was a little bit of civilization there. There was camping, there were tents, and there were some buildings that Swamiji had built. There, the domes that you may see in pictures from time to time. And so that was what was there for the retreat at that point. So the weekend retreat was really nice, really nice. Swamiji gave almost all the classes. He taught us Hong Saw, which probably most of us didn't know. We met all sorts of people that we had not known before, people who probably were from his classes in San Francisco that he gave. And so we stayed then after the weekend was over, and we volunteered for a while, and that was a good idea because, of course, they always need volunteers there at the retreat. And we did some things to help out, and we continued to stay. And Swami began spending the summer coming back every couple of weeks and giving another retreat weekend, just like the one that we had all been to earlier. That was a wonderful summer. we all got a chance to get to know each other well, sort of well anyway. And we were, we had a really nice time. We did took care of the place, and we kept things clean, and we cooked and went into town for groceries and kept everything kind of moving along because he wanted to keep the summer having retreats every few weeks like he did. And so he managed to succeed to have that. And so Swami was the director of the retreat, and then there was the, what was Satya called? What's he called? There's Satya. Some of you know Satya. Satya was the retreat master. That's right. That one he was called that. And he taught the yoga postures. He was the only person I've ever seen who could actually lead yoga postures without saying anything. When he would do it while he was in silence sometimes. And he never would say anything. He would just start off and start doing one posture after another. And people would just watch him and follow along and try to do their best. And when it was time to move, change position, he would knock on the floor. Everybody knew, okay, now it's time to switch. Okay. So anyway, it was very instructive there. Here we learned how to meditate. We learned Hong Sa, and then we also learned a lot of yoga postures. A very good start for somebody who's beginning to learn to meditate and to have a practice and begin to have a lifestyle that included meditations. This was very, very nice for us. And we also met like-minded people, just very often people that were very much like us. And so we continued that throughout the summer. And eventually, of course, we came to the winter coming up, where we had to figure out what to do for that winter, particularly for that winter. And I'm not going to tell you this story now. This can be for another time, but we decided to make teepees, and that was a whole lot of fun. It took a lot of effort and probably a lot of wasted energy, but we did that. But most of us then went off to the Bay Area for the winter and got jobs in the Bay Area, and that was probably more practical than trying to live in a teepee. So this is what we did then. Well, I'm kind of convinced that was kind of the beginning of our annual work days that we have. It's called Rajasi Day in honor of Rajasi Janakananda, and it's every May 8 on his birthday. And this is what we do every year, every single year, unless there's some catastrophe going on. We have a big work day, mostly at Ananda Village. Although I think once in a while we end up doing something at the meditation retreat as well. But we just let everyone know in all of our centers, people that sometimes come as guests, and we just let everyone know that we're having it on May 8th, and they're all invited to come. And we clean things up and build stuff and fix stuff and paint and do all the kind of things that we need to do about once a year at the village. And I do remember that one year Jaya and I were the village managers for a while, and one year we painted the village office, which was fine, working along. We had a bunch of people helping us, and we went along all day long painting. And pretty soon the sky was getting kind of gray. But we kept on painting, and things went on okay for a little while longer. Pretty soon, plink, 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 raindrops, plinking, plinking, plinking. By the time we finally gave up, the whole exterior of the building was back to its original whatever it was before. It was supposed to be painted yellow, but now it was, I don't know, I don't remember what color it was, but we had to start all over again in a couple of days. And so these are the kind of stories that you all hear about Rajasi Day and a few other interesting things that happen from time to time. But something I learned that was a very nice thing to hear there was a man who was visiting. He was just at the Expanding Light, and he came over to where we were all working, and he asked if he could help, and sure, you can help. And he said, "Oh, this is the most wonderful thing. Here, there are all kinds of people with lots of talents and training, and they have big responsibilities, and they do all kinds of things that require a lot happy to let somebody else take over for them for this day. And we'll go off and just work. We won't do anything very important, as these people say. And they just they're happy to just do that. Just trade places with somebody who maybe doesn't have very much experience, but maybe they know enough to sort of supervise whatever happens to be going on. This is the kind of thing that happens. And the question that Ramurti left for me was, okay, all right, so shall I just stop at this point, or what?
Questions.
Oh, questions, yes. Well, okay, let's stop here, and we'll have questions. Did you raise your hand, Sita? Is that what you did? No. Okay.
So I'll ask a question.
All right.
Sadhana, what lesson could you impart from that?
Right. Yes, I have noticed that over the years that kind of thing where we get together as one family makes the strongest and largest bonds that I ever see at Ananda is when we have a big group together like that. I know that the COVID people would just be horrified to know we're in a big gathering together, but for at least most of the time, we can get together like that, interact, chat, talk about stuff, work in this spot and maybe that spot, maybe I'll work in the garden now, I'm tired of painting. All of those things help us to create bonds, spiritual bonds. I was talking with somebody, we go to India a lot, and I was there not a few years ago talking with someone there, and we started talking about soul friends, soul friendships, and how, you have a friend in one lifetime, and then you die, and you go to the astral world, and, well, you may see them again at the astral world, or when you come back, you might, in fact, see them again, and again, and again. And time goes by and you make more soul friends. And it's as though, when you meet again after being apart, there's this soul recognition. And it's as though you've never been apart. You've been together throughout all these, perhaps all eons of time, who knows. And the way that these things happen is by interacting with people, sharing, doing things together. These create those kinds of bonds. Okay.
The temperature, I know I've heard a lot of people always refer to the winters there. So I'm curious, like, are we talking like 30 degrees, 20 degrees below zero? I mean,
It's the rain.
What?
The winters.
Yeah, the winters are not that cold, 30 below.
It's the rain. It's the rain.
The rain, yes.
okay.
Yeah, the rain are going down about freezing, around 30 and 30 above, but a little below that, yeah.
Yeah, it continues. It's the rain is especially, actually global warming has been noticeable because it used to be a little colder than it is now. But
Yeah.
it's the winter. The winter is gray, days in the 40s usually, and if it's rainy season, it's just you need shelter. I wanted to pick it up a couple of points that after we got started, and we learned this the hard way, looking back, but it was a good lesson, is there's the issue, and I'm sure when you had Atman sharing with you, he spoke about this as well, because I became the person, after those some years had gone by, we became more organized, that was in charge. I was the interface person with the county of Nevada County, all the departments in Nevada County, health department, building department, planning department. I was that face that would go to the planning commission, would go to the board of supervisors. I held that position for many years, and I actually passed it on, to Atman. And a couple of things lessons I had learned in there, in doing that, is that friendship and dealing with the government in terms of people is important. Lots of times people got a chip on their shoulder sometimes, and that includes people here at Ananda. Oh, that government, and they and they, the bureaucracy, and they go on about that, which is, people like to do that. They get frustrated. But really, it's what you're talking. It's not, the government is not some amorphous thing. It's people, and you have to deal with people. So if somebody starts a community, issues come up. Inevitably, one is you are in an environment when you're going to be dealing with other people. You're not an island. The most immediate ones are your neighbors. And people, if you don't have good relationships with your neighbors, or if you don't know how to deal with people as neighbors, you're going to have continual problems. And then from the neighbors, you expand that out to your neighborhood, to your local, if you're out in the country, to your local town. Are you welcomed, or do you got to, don't go in there with an institutional chip on your shoulder, and because it's just, you're going to run into problems, and especially when you're dealing with the locals. Now, Ananda's got a lot of, let us say, interesting neighbors.
Yeah.
We're in a marijuana growing, we've always been in a marijuana growing hotbed of California, and we've had, it's way out in the boondocks, and so you got outlaws, and you've got people who are asocial, maladapted people, and you also got very highly intellectually brilliant people come out who just want to live by themselves, away from the hubbub, all sorts. And you have to be able to work with them in a humble, neighborly fashion. And there's a certain amount, and I've seen this, this is going to sound hard, and I don't take it too hard, but people from Ananda in here at the village, I had to always warn them, don't be an elitist, because that's somehow how we are perceived, as elitists. And by that I mean, we know we are following the right path, right? I mean, I feel that we are, but I'm not going to project that. If you start projecting that I'm somehow better than you, who are, tamasic and blah, 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 you're just going to have a heck of a hard time. You have to find and so whoever it is that's responsible, and all of us, if you're in a community, are responsible for this, you have to maintain spiritual humility. And otherwise, the spiritual, that's a basic for the spiritual path. But we have to maintain institutional humility. That doesn't mean compromising what we do, but you have to have an open heart to whatever whatever situation you're in, and not, oh, I don't like those people because they're X, Y, Z. You can't do that, because because that applies to your neighbors. So it was my job in those days to it's because that wasn't a job told to do this, but I assumed it because it was so needed. Is with the team of the village management team in the old days, the village man, is just to reach out and so when somebody had a problem in the neighborhood, they knew who to come to, and they'd come talk to me, and I said, oh, geez, I'm sorry, Bob, or I'm sorry, Tom, or let's work it out, and just be friends with people. And it goes a long way. People get stuck in the ditch, and I'd get the tractor out and go pull them out and deliver their groceries and help. And then some of these people are pretty rough too, and so but you can deal with them as people. Now, I came from a background that helped me do that, but nevertheless, now it starts with that. But then you got to go to my job was to deal with the county, all those bureaucrats, and and pretty soon you've got a hostile relationship with the local planning department. You got a hostile relationship with the building department, the fire department, the health department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to cause you problems because it's like that. You know, you maybe have heard this story. It's not my. I've had my own stories, but I like Nitai's better. Is Nitai? You know, the fire inspector comes out and tells Nitai he's building the school. I mean, you know, we basically hands on, and he built the school. He builds the school, and it's got to get department. Fire department shows up. The guy inspector from the fire department says, "You can't do this. You got to have a 20-foot or 4-foot wide asphalt road, fire safety, evacuation for these kids. What if you have fire? They got to be a 24-foot asphalt road out to the main highway." And you know, Nitai just, you know, he just didn't know what to do. He couldn't do it. And he said, "I can't." And he says, "No, I'm coming back, you know, in another month or whatever it was, and I want to see your plan and what you're going to do. And otherwise, I'm not going to sign it off that you can have this school. And you need the fire, you know, in our area, you need the fire department to say okay." So Nitai was just, he could not do all those things, but he could pray. And he did pray intensely to Divine Mother and Master. "If you want a school here, Master, you're going to have to help me." So the guy showed, you know, the fellow comes, he comes. And Nitai goes up to this guy, and it was a different guy. It was a different guy. And he goes up to him and he says, "Well, what happened to the other guy?" And he says, "Well, he got transferred." I says, "Oh, yeah, well," and Nitai says, "Well, you know, he wanted me to build this 24-foot wide road, and you know, you can see here the situation." And he was really nice to this guy, and the guy was really appreciated Nitai's gentleness, you know. And he said, "Well, maybe we can figure a solution out." And so he thought a minute, and he asked Nitai. He says, "Nitai, or what's Nitai's name?"
Michael.
Michael. Michael. He says, "Do you have a whistle?" And Nitai says, "Well, no. Can you go buy a whistle, you know?" And he says, "Yeah, I can get a whistle." He says, "Well, you take that whistle and you wear it around your neck." And he says, "If you got a fire comes up, any danger, blow the whistle. And I think that'll do." And he says, "Well, what about the road?" He says, "Oh, don't worry about the road. Get a whistle." And he left him, signed him off, and he left. Now, I had not quite as dramatic as that, but I had so many experiences that you just have to get to know the guy, get to know the building inspector. He's a guy too. He's got a job to do. How can you help him do his job? Yet also, you know, it's a, you know, there's little, how, and he'll help you. If you help the planner department, if you help the health department. Now, sometimes these guys get really obstreperous and are tough. But these are things that don't happen one day at a time. You have to build a long-term relationship. So if you wanted to make a community, that's one thing to keep in mind. Neighbors and your building your bureaucracy. Now this brings up the issue of legality. We were totally illegal. Now I don't recommend that. And but if you're going to do, you know, see some people they now, and I don't, I'm publicly, I'm not sure if I'm on firm ground saying this, but I was willing to bend the rules. Now I don't know if that's proper or not, but I always said, well, but I always said this: if I'm breaking the rules, just to get, you know, we're starting. If we would have followed all the rules, we would have never started. But I said, but I realized something quickly. It's karma is involved. If you break the rules, you cannot be upset when the karma hammer comes and hits you. Are you willing to accept the karma? You see, you don't want to break a rule that if you get caught, you're going to get sent to prison or something. That's not worth it. But if you're going to have to pay a fine, okay, I'm willing to pay the fine. And I'm willing, and I'm breaking the rule not because I want to keep breaking the rules, but I got to get over to there, and so I just have no choice, and I'm going to make it up once I get there. You see, my intention is to be legal and be a good citizen and all of that, But you can't go so far off that if you get caught, your project sinks. You see, I can pay a fine, I can do this. And so when we started, I was creative. That's what I like to say. I was creative, but I knew you can't be so creative that you endanger your project. And ideally, you don't want to be creative at all like that. But I'm just telling you how it was in 1976 or 75. And if you're working with the people and you know the people in the government and then you're your friends, they help you. Say, look, I got a problem here. How am I going to help? And they get a whistle. Now that guy was, but that wouldn't happen. I mean, you can't, it all goes together and don't get so far out on a limb that because you don't want to do something that endangers that building inspector's job either, because he's willing to look the other way a little bit. If he knows you have integrity, that you're not really doing it for selfish purposes and you're going to fix it when you get to it. And that's what we would do. We couldn't meet the deadlines, but they say, look, I know you want to. And eventually we did meet all those deadlines. It just took us a little longer. And that's all. And that's all we were doing was buying time so that we could get to the point. So this is a very sensitive thing, and you can't make hard and fast. But the basis of it is I'm not telling you to break rules. I'm telling you to make relationships so that when you can work with the government that be in such a way that you have a problem, how are we going to fix it? And then how are we going to get from here to there? And that, it's kind of hard to pinpoint it down, but I found that to be very, very helpful. It's about people, and it's about people, and it's about don't look down on anybody. They got a job to do, and be sympathetic to them and help them. And I think then you'll come out better. Because I've visited other communities, and they've got a chip on their shoulder. They got a chip on,
Just what I was going to say.
Yeah, and it's not right. It's not right to be that way. To think that you're better than somebody else, you can't do that. Anyway, any questions on that? Okay.
Jaya, that's really helpful. I wonder if you could, and Sadhana, thank you both. I wonder if you guys could share just how you go about naturally making friends and what ways for you throughout the years, both within Ananda, but Jaya, like you were saying, with the planning department and just being yourself, and how you can encourage us just to relax, be yourself, and make friends with people in that way.
That's really important, I think. And, it's kind of scary at first, I'm sure. I was just remembering when Jaya was talking about all the stuff with the county and all that, remembering how I was actually, well, I guess I wasn't personally asked to do this, but at one point, not that many years ago, but one of the managers at Ananda Village asked me if I would be willing to, or if I would like to, work for the local fire department. Well, the fire department is down about two miles down the road, and it wasn't. I don't know. I was kind of surprised to hear that. I said, "Well, why did they ask me?" And well, they didn't really know. But what had happened at the fire department, which is a local volunteer fire department, so really all the people that worked there were just plain people. They weren't anybody high up in the bureaucracy or any of those kinds of things. And so, unfortunately, their fire department, they had somebody working for them in the office who embezzled some funds, and it was quite a lot of money. This poor, it's this tiny fire department. There's hardly anybody that works there. Everybody's a volunteer, except for just a small staff. And they decided that maybe Ananda had some people that would be honest if they came to work for them. And so I heard all that, and they asked me if I wanted to do this, and I thought, this would be a really kind of a nice outreach thing to do. It's kind of like what happened to Jaya all the time, having to forever talk to all kinds of bureaucrats and so forth. But it was a similar thing because I would go in there and I didn't know anything about how they did fires and all that, but I was okay. They didn't mind. They showed me what I needed to do, and they were happy with the fact that I didn't embezzle any money. I think maybe that was the biggest thing, but it was a real education for me because it showed me that here, going off to some place like that where, it's not coming from Ananda, it's just me, just a person. I was not representing Ananda particularly. I was just doing what I was, hired to do. We did similar things, not Ananda itself, but in the neighborhood, especially in the town of Nevada City. We had, I think, 3 stores at one time in Nevada City, and one of them is still there. We sold it. It was a health food store, and we sold it 10 years ago or something like that. But also we had a gifts and clothing kind of fancy kind of store also in the town of Nevada City. And these were ways that we interfaced with the community there. They wouldn't have gotten to know us very easily if all they could have done was come out to go to a Sunday service, and for many people they were not at all interested. But the fact that we had a health food store, well, that was interesting, and they shopped at our stores. And the same thing with the other one that was the gifts and clothing store. And so it really did, I think, really did make a difference. We got to know more and more people in town and became more and more associated with them rather than being these sort of weird people that are doing some kind of cultish thing out there in the country, So this is what we did.
I think it's true. It goes back to getting to know your neighbors.
Yeah.
And seeing people as souls. And if we were to bring this into the spiritual realm of our path, and I tell people, I says, Master said, if you want to be in tune with the Guru, you should serve his work. Mm-hmm. And to me, that means each of us individually takes on the responsibility of being a representative of Master in everything we do. In other words, you have to see that, and as it's my job as a disciple to represent Master in every interaction that I have with people. I am basically, if they don't like, if I insult somebody, it's Master. They're going to say, "Oh, you're a disciple of this. What's he? What kind of representation are you doing? He must not have been a very good Master." And I think we represent Swamiji, I found myself thinking in that way, but also Master Swamiji, and to feel that they are working through us and that I represent them, and people are going to, judge this. And as in the same thing, I would think I'm in that position of going into dealing with county officials and board of supervisors. I was representing Ananda. So, if you want Ananda to be accepted, I'm me. That's me. They have to, I have to be on my best behavior. But it wasn't hard to be. I just would be myself, and and here's another person. I can be friendly, and people really appreciate that because people have, if I don't know what sort of, if a person starts an intentional community and there's some intent by that community, people in the neighborhood, they start identifying, what is that? Who is that? What are they doing? And so you can't help it but be put on the spot. It's kind of you might say it can be a burden for some people to know that you carry that responsibility, but we do. And if we're, in Ananda's case, we do. So I think it's just be a good person and do what's the appropriate thing. Making friends. I don't know. I really can't answer your question. I don't know what to say. But any other questions along those lines, and then we're going to move on. Okay. I wanted to make up. I wanted to say a little bit about our work in India, because we tried to start a community in India in the countryside outside of the city of Pune. honestly, it didn't work. It didn't work, and I've spent a lot of my time thinking about why didn't that what did we where did we go off on that? Why didn't that work? How might we have done it differently? And you know it's difficult to come to any conclusions. It just wasn't in the cards, you might say. But I think one of the things that we I think we made a mistake is that we approached that project. And I think you can learn, if we learn from our mistakes, then I think then there's something valuable there. And not to do that is, again, you have to have an intention. What is your intention when you're going to start something? And we did not have a very clear intention that what we wanted to do. And if we, to the degree that we did have an intention, was it realistically, or was it too far out beyond the realm of practicality of what the people that would participate in that would be able to accept? And I think that was, to some degree, you had a group of Americans coming into a foreign country and going forward with this idealism that the locals were not
Ugly
willing
Americans.
to, we're not willing to accept, you might say, or buy into. And the idea that locals had and the idea that we had were very different, and it didn't mesh. And that was our fault because we were the ones that were initiating that. Now, that's one part of it. We weren't clear of what we intended. And it comes out, if you're going to start a community, again, I started out by saying, what kind of community? Now, the locals, what they wanted was they wanted to have a place in the country where they could have a timeshare or apartment of their own, a little place where they could go for 2 to 3 to 4 weeks out of the year to be at the ashram. And then they go back to the city and live their lives, but it was a vacation home, a retreat home at the ashram. They could be, now Swami was there at that time, where they could be with the Guru, with the Swami, but then they had no intention of living there. I'll live there. Heck no, I'm not going to live there. Whereas we were starting the idea that we wanted to have a community. And it was two very different tracks that were happening. And so you found that we started to create this housing complex that was basically empty most of the time. And you don't have a community unless you have people. So it wasn't a living community. It was a timeshare place. Started to go that direction. So that was one problem. That problem and many of the other problems that a failure to have clear intentions on all parties involved. Second part of that is we didn't involve the people who were going to live in this community and be in this community. We didn't involve them enough into the creation of that community. It just was a cultural difference. People don't get out there in India and pick up a hammer and saw. They just don't. And so consequently, there's no active participation in the creation of it. It was interesting that we would have work days in some of our centers. You know how Rajasi Day, or we have Saturday going to paint the ashram building or clean it up, tidy, clean the dark. And Ramurti, you know this, they'd bring their servants to the work day to do the work. You remember that? And that was that was a very different concept. But I think in terms of building that community in Pune, it would have been a lot. It was not an organic evolutionary thing out of a group of people. It was that concept of the movie, if you build it, they will come. Mm-hmm. It was sort of approached on that level. If we build this thing, it'll be very nice and people will come. Well, they came, but for different intentions for why we were doing. And we realized in retrospect, my perspective, now others may differ if you hear other stories about this, we should have gone along and should have taken our time and let it have grown organically. Now, if somebody wants to create a community and you just if you think of community as a cluster of buildings, and you create these buildings and you have a community, that's something very different. That's not a community, that's a housing development. And if you're, and I have no interest, I had no interest in creating a housing development. I would like to have created a community. And a community means people come first. And then the people come first and, oh, we need houses. Ah, what are we going to do? Well, that we, the people, are going to build houses. We're going to create this, or if you don't have the physical skills, we are going to hire somebody and we're going to be part of that process. And it's organic. One house, another building, this building, and all the process important than the final product. The process is the building of community. So to just purchase something and then just get it all ideal and then get people to come in, they had no involvement in creating that. So they're not invested emotionally in the finished product to the degree that they could have been if they were part of the process of creation. And so a community has to start, well, and you could say it started in Swami's living room in San Francisco, and then it started, and the people came, and there was nothing, and that was the best thing probably looking back, because everybody had to figure, what are we going to do? And everybody was, and we didn't, we have to work together. Well, how do you work together? That in itself is kind of a challenge. And you learn how to, what works, what doesn't work, and you fumble along. But in the process, you create a community. And I think just following up what Sadhana Devi says about those work days, I can't remember who originated this, where this comes from, but the creation of a community is defined as people working together, meditating together, serving. Probably should have said serving together, eating together, having fun together. You see, those things, doing things together in that way is jointly. A neighborhood of isolated buildings, and is not necessarily a community. So here's another thing to think about. If somebody purchases land that doesn't have much on it and wants to build things, Master used to say, immortalize your ideals in architecture. Remember that? Somewhere he said that. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, okay, a beautiful artistic building. Well, that's one way to look at it, but I think of it, architecture as something larger than that. Immortalize your ideals in the arrangement of your physical environment to promote your ideals. You see, so what are your ideals? What are you trying to create in community? It could be many different types, there's no one that works. And whatever those ideals and the goals, what is the intention of the community? And then create your physical environment to support those ideals. So in one little way, after the place burned down in 1976, we came back with the ideal of putting houses as far away from any other house as possible. We came back with the idea, well, why don't we cluster the houses together? Try to build little neighborhoods where people shared certain infrastructure. For example, it's cheaper to do it that way, but it also promotes certain people getting together. And then, besides that, let's leave the space in between these clusters vacant, forest, so it's natural. So you have wildlife and you have the environmental benefits of that. So that's an example of trying to, those are ideals of community, ideals of environmentalism that you can manifest through your planning. And planning is just an extension of architecture. So immortalize your ideals in architecture, and whatever you do, how is it going to serve? What builds community? Now, oftentimes people have asked me about Ananda Village, building community. And I say, what's important? What's the most important building in the community to create community? And of course, you ask that person, say, it must be the temple. Well, yeah, this is not an objective thing. Everybody has their own opinion. I think it's the mailroom. I think,
Or maybe the front lawn.
or maybe it's, I think it's the mail room, it's the market,
The market, yeah.
it's the trash bins on Saturday, and it's it's the front lawn, in good weather. In other words, what I'm saying is, it's those places where people have common goals and ideals, and it's the parking, and all of these things where people interface and come together for common needs and common things. Now, of course, that extends to a temple as well, but those places are things that need to be considered and consideration, because people come up with the ideas say, oh, we ought to put the mailroom way over there, and we ought to, and you said, no, 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 you got to. So people cross paths, and unconsciously, community is created. You see, you want to do, or people don't think about it; it just happens. So you want to facilitate your design in such a way that you facilitate interaction. Now, looking back on our community here at the village, we haven't done that as well as we could have. In 2020 hindsight is always good, but we've learned the lessons maybe by not doing some of the things we could have done. But if you're going forward, you see, you can take those to heart and do stuff consciously. Okay, now quite another time for questions here.
This is all very interesting. Thank you very much. I've been up to Ananda there. It's lovely, lovely place. I'm wondering about new community members. Like how do people choose to come? Do they purchase a home there? And do you have some kind of, vetting process? Do you have any control over who comes?
That is a big, 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 big question.
Right, right.
And it's something that has evolved. You know what Ananda is now and what we started in 1970. Really, they're very different. A lot of things are different. We don't have that dollar entry fee anymore. And we have evolved from you might say, from a cooperative community. We've kind of evolved more into an ashram mode, and it's unique. It's hard to put a name on it, is of what exactly we are. But people there is a vetting process. We've become and because one of the reasons is because Ananda now has all these metro communities where people are whereas Ananda Village has become, you might say, more of the grandfather place. I hope not just by those of us that are grandfather age, but because we've been around and we kind of hold the ideal here. So it's become more of an ashram oriented, where people come. We accept people who are disciples and kriyabans. That would be a criterion. We look at the criteria from that
Wow,
level.
you have to be a Kriyaban to live there.
Participation in the spiritual side, and then there is a vetting process to it, and we give people time, years maybe even, and people come in, and there is financial response. People have to be financially responsible. Ideally, we would have more rental space than we do, and people can rent. And there's some people who want to invest money into housing. That's a possibility too. So, but the mechanics of that are things that evolved over decades, and I better not go into that too much because it's too technical. But yes, the answer is yes.
Right, yes.
Okay.
Cheryl,
it is kind
if
of
you
tricky with the fair housing laws in California specifically, and how you work all that out. So thank you very much. I appreciate that answer.
There are those.
Cheryl, if you go to, I assume you got an email telling you about this. Down at the bottom of that, there are links to the previous sessions. And if you go to Atman's, ATMAN, you'll find more additional and detailed information about membership there.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, housing is a very complicated, and it took a long, long time. But we've got a pretty good model here, and so you can pursue that.
Mhm. How is it raising a family? Well, there was a lot about it that was very nice, very maybe easier than living in a place where there's a lot of population that everybody has to interact with. We had the blessing, really, of one, when our daughter was brand new, 2 years old or something like that. We managed to have a little play group of 4 kids, and there were 4 days in the week that most of us could be available to be the mother. And so Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, we took turns on those days, and Wednesday was the day off, and the little kids came over. They were all little girls at the time. And some year or two went by, and it worked out really nice, except for the poor two little boys that came a bit later. I finally referred to them as henpecked. The little girls were in charge, and they were definitely not going to change. And so, what turned out to be a blessing, another blessing, was a young woman came. She was just finishing college, and she was taking a course in how to run a preschool. And so we got her to, we asked her if she wanted to do that. She said, yeah, okay. We said, that's wonderful. We'll have a preschool. And the preschool even had some boys in it, but there were enough kids by that time that they kind of were, I don't know what you would call it. So they didn't get into too much arguing and so forth. But they had a good time together. I have a picture of them there. The teacher invited Swami to come and visit the children, and they had some pictures taken. And so one of the pictures is of all of the kids at one end of the seesaw, and they're all at the bottom, of course, because there's so many of them. Or that's how it's supposed to be, isn't it? And then you look at it and then you realize, no, it's Swami that is at the bottom, and all the little kids are up at the top because they're the lightest, even all of them together. Anyway, it's a really cute picture, but it kind of shows you that, the kids can get along, and they can get together, and they can have fun, and they can, go and do things that are interesting, and they'll learn a lot by being together and doing things that expand their little part of the world that they inhabit. But we did also have not only this woman, her name was Saraswati, and then we also had Nitai. Nitai came to Ananda about the time he graduated from college, which was, I think, in Sacramento. So it was very close by. And he had already wanted to work with kids. And so he came and visited for a little while, and then he eventually stayed. So that was how we had actual regular school teacher, first grade on up. And at first he had to be in a chicken coop. That was all we had. But he managed to make it work for a little while, at least, until they moved into this building that Jaya was referring to, the building inspector. That building has been started by someone else before Nitai even came. And that man then kind of walked off the job and gave it up. But Nitai took it over and got it fixed up. And they still have that school building there. In fact, they've enlarged it and added on to it and so forth. And so it's a very nice building. And there's lots of kids. One of the things that comes up often is, well, what about homeschooling? And especially right now when we have all this trouble with the COVID and we can't just, send our kids to a school where there's a bunch of kids. And that's something that kind of is a bit of an issue, and it goes back and forth, I think. I've heard many pros and cons from different people about the benefits or not the benefits of keeping your kids at home and working on them with their lessons. Well, I don't know, and I don't have an answer. We never did get around to having homeschooling. It was always at least 4 or 5 kids or more. and it had a regular teacher, not it wasn't at home. But that is something to consider and think about. That was one thing that never really got quite worked out.
I think, if I can add something here about some of the lessons learned from this is for the kids. I think many of the kids, when they grow up, when they're teenagers, they feel a little bit growing up in a community that's been their world. They feel somewhat confined. They want to expand because that's actually a good thing, because they want to get out. They want to experience the bigger world. And of course, they can, when they go into, many of them, when they got to high school age, they wanted to go to the public school, they wanted to expand. But one of the benefits that I've seen is that kids that grow up in a community like ours, they form very tight relationships with their peers of their generation of kids that they grew up with. They form lifelong friendships with them, and that sometimes I think when you don't have that opportunity, they miss that. People miss that. So I know our daughter has formed a lifetime relationship with just kids that she grew up with. She still keeps in touch with them. But one of the things I've noticed is that kids growing up in the community learned to relate to adults. I think somewhat better than kids in general, because lots of times kids in general, they don't. I think you could say it because they're in the community. The adults in the community take an interest in the kids, get to know them, get to know who they are. We're uncles and aunties, you might say. They got dozens of uncles and aunties, and they learn that interaction ability of how to deal with adults and to relate to and talk to adults, which is a skill that we don't think of it so much as a skill, but sometimes you find the kids just don't know how to relate, and it can be a hindrance to them. The other thing, when I noticed, now I haven't, I've been off in India, so I can't speak contemporary, about the contemporary situation, but when Sadhana Devi and I were in the 1980s, 1990s, village management, a lot of kids, many more kids than we've got now, and the kids, when people would ask, how the kids were doing and whatnot, and they were going to school out in this little country school and multi-age classrooms and all that, and the kids they did actually really well, and usually most of them when they would go to public school. But one of the things that most of the kids would, when they would go to public school, like let's say the high school, they wanted to get a bigger experience. They had as in comparison to many others, the ability to relate with other kids and to relate with the teachers, relate with adults. Their social skills were high. They had higher social skills for whatever reason, that a little bit more mature in social skills. But the one thing that they found that the kids, the local kids, our kids, were, you might at a distance, tended to be more sensitive. They would say, why are these people like this? Because kids, how kids are when they're teenagers, you can be kind of tough, cruel, especially those, those sort of interactions can be a little, whereas coming from the environment of growing up in the village, and when there was a lot of kids in those days, the whole educational system was trying to be sensitive to other people's realities. And then you go into an environment where the kids aren't necessarily wanting to be sensitive, and they would be a little bit of a shock to them at first, and they'd have to gear themselves up to being able to deal with that. But generally, it was because they were more sensitive, which is a good quality to have as an adult. Is you're able to relate to other people's realities, and then usually you can be successful in whatever you do. So usually we found that the kids did very well, that in the microcosm of a little environment moving out into a bigger environment. And it's such a joy to still see some of those kids come back from time to time. Questions? Oh, there is a quite. Let's look at the chat box. Oh, yeah, we got a couple in the chat box there. Okay, is there still land in Pune where the Ananda community facilitates retreats? Yeah, Ram. Yes, there is. We still own that retreat. We still own that property. And what we did is the community part of that property didn't work. But the retreat part of the property, it actually is quite a nice little retreat. It's been severely impacted by the COVID-19, and we can't publicly operate it for the last 9 months. So that's been a real difficult thing. So it's on very low profile, right? You might say it's limping along on life support, really, because of the situation. And I don't think when's the virus going to get over? Uh, it's out in the country, and actually, the villagers, the local neighborhood population, doesn't want any outsiders coming into that area because of the virus situation.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we're stuck. And so, as far as operating as a retreat, only people who want to go there to stay for like a long period of time. You're not, but coming and going, no, we can't have that right now. But we do have it, and once the virus is over, we're going to have to make an analysis of what do we do, where do we go from here, because it's almost like we'll have to restart again because it's gone into hibernation. But the other side, we had 30 acres of property there. We basically split the property in two, and we're in the process of selling half of that land. We're going to keep the retreat site where Swami's house is, and we're going to sell the other half, and lots of reasons, but then pay off our debts, we hope, some of them at least. And so we'll keep the other side, but what the future of that retreat site is, we're like everything's in abeyance because of this virus situation. So we'll have to wait and see. Second question, you're planning a new co-housing project in Yolo County and very interested in having a spiritual component. Probably Atman talked about this. And when we went to, I learned this also when we went to Rhode Island. We thought about perhaps having a community there. Before you do anything, get involved and invested. And if you're interested in doing a community, you need to investigate the county regulations of what zoning land use regulations are. And for example, in Rhode Island, I was found that it would be impossible practically, legally, to do a community there similar to what we had at Ananda Village in some multiple housing units on one piece of property. It's very, very difficult because of the zoning. But if we would have done the same thing in Massachusetts, we could have done it easily, zone from legal wise, land use wise. So it just the border matters. So if you in California, there are state rules, but there's county is the more important one. You need to go to the county and find out what is your intent? What are you wanting to develop? How does that fit in with your zoning regulations? Like what if we were to try to recreate Ananda Village in Nevada County now, I think it'd probably be pretty close to impossible. We came in at a fortuitous time historically, but now very different. So you want to find out what the obstacles are that you're going to be facing, but then adapt in such a way that you can do it.
Before people start going away, I want to mention that um, Sadhana Devi is the author of the History of Ananda. There's a series of books on the history of Ananda, and she's putting together a number of links and other ways so that we all can access that. And so in the coming week, we'll be sending out some reference resources and links to videos. And there's a series of videos called The History of Ananda, I think it's 1 through 5. And so there is actually, we didn't know it, there is a wealth of material about Ananda in the early days, pictures, and I think most of you would find it a great joy to look through these. If you've been around Ananda very long at all, you'll see some pictures of people who weren't gray at one point in their life. In fact, they look like kids. And and as well as the type of thing we were hearing earlier about just how the different kind of incarnations of the community were in the first 2 or 3 years is very fascinating. And we'll get these out to you because it's just a wealth of wonderful material that's informative far beyond just building a community. It's wonderful to learn about Swami in that time period and so many people who are our leaders now and how they came in and what they did in the early years. So thank you, Jaya and Sadhana Devi.
Thank you for having us.